I'm delighted to introduce our first panel, which is Reimagining Data Strategies, What Global Change Has Taught Us. And joining me on this panel is Pedro Rente Lourenco, Head Data Scientist at Laing O'Rourke, Rob Clifford, Head of Data, Maritime and Land at BAE Systems, Rupesh Moore, Enterprise Architecture, Data and Analytics at Konecranes, and Charles Southwood, who is the Vice President of North Europe and MEA at Denodo. So thank you all for joining us. It's great to have you with us. I'd love to just kick off by going around the four of you and quickly asking you to do some quick introductions. So Pedro, if I could come to you first.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Pedro. I'm lead data scientist at Laing O'Rourke. Laing O'Rourke is a global construction business, and we're doing quite a large data and digital transformation. And as part of that, we're right from the start trying to look into data science opportunities. My background is actually from a completely different setup. I'm a biomedical engineer by background, got into artificial intelligence through that arm. And I've worked in the past for Vodafone Group until somewhat recently when I moved to Laing O'Rourke.
Thanks, Pedro. Rob, if I could come to you next.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Shamna. And good morning, everyone. So Rob Clifford, I'm, as it says in the title, Head of Data for BAE, Maritime and Land. That's a relatively large business. So BAE, we're a defence prime, probably the prime in the UK. My job is to sit in the sort of the chief operating officer's part of the business, and I look across data, strategy analytics for naval ships, maritime services, submarines, and land. Prior to taking up this role, which I took up very recently, I was head of digital strategy and policy for the Royal Navy as a consultant. And prior to that, I spent 16 odd years in central government, so Home Office and other places, again, working on data strategy and policy. Really excited to join the session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Charles, would you like to go next?
Good morning. I'm Charles Southwood. I'm the Regional Vice President for Denodo Technologies. If anyone is not familiar with Denodo, we're the world leader in data virtualization, which is a technology that's now widely used to accelerate data integration. And I've been in similar roles for some 30 or so years, and have been with Denodo now for 5 years. And I'm responsible for our business across Northern Europe, Middle East and Africa. Interestingly, also, I have a background in engineering, so I can relate to the Laing O'Rourke challenges as well.
Thank you, Charles. And finally, Rupesh.
Hello there. My name is Rupesh Moore, and I work as an architect focusing on data and analytics for Konecranes Global Corporation. We are a leader in lifting businesses and manufacturing of cranes and servicing them. I focus on analytics and basically as part of that data platform and supporting digitalization and data science related activities. And very happy to join this forum to talk about the data strategy.
Thank you, Rupesh. So to kick off then, I think we have more people joining us. So if you didn't join us at the beginning, just a reminder to everyone that there is an open Q&A box running throughout this entire session. So if you have a question, please do put it into the chat function and we will pose that to our panelists. And also you can put your screen in speaker view and that will just help you see who is speaking at the time. So to kick off with this panel then, what has changed most about data strategy in the last year? Charles, if I could come to you first to cover that.
Yeah, I think, well, since last March, we've all seen the switch to remote communications and online engagement encompassing pretty much all areas of societal interaction, retail services, the universal home working that we're all experiencing, to virtual B2B engagements like we've got today, in fact. Some industries such as travel and hospitality have obviously had to take pretty rapid steps towards cost reduction, and many others have had to switch to online remote engagement models. Others like home delivery and perhaps e-commerce businesses have done very well during this time and have had to urgently scale up. But whatever the business change might have been, one thing they all have in common was the need to become more agile and the urgent revision of some of their business strategies, which we will be discussing, have been reflected in their underlying data strategy. The use of data virtualization, which is our experience, we see widely being used for enabling some of this business agility, and has for many years now been shown to accelerate the data integration and business transformation. at Denodo, as a large specialist in the market, we've seen an acceleration of about 20%, I would say, during the last year in market uptake for data virtualization. And I think it's fair to say that the adoption has been cross-industry. So with no real change in the industry segmentation, essentially any business that had significantly depended on data integration and data insights was able from adopting a data strategy that included data virtualization. And I think the key to the success really was around the time to market and the agility that it had brought to these businesses. According to some customer feedback, they were saving about 2/3 of the time for deployment. And that obviously has a really transformational effect when you've got something urgent like the pandemic and you're having to change your business models. So this has enabled us a rapid adoption and resulting business agility to support these new strategies.
Thanks, Charles. Pedro, I'd like to come to you next in terms of what you've seen in your industry. What has changed most about data strategy for you?
It's an interesting one because when the pandemic hit, I was actually working for a Vodafone Group, and a lot had changed in that setting, in the way we approached are going to work, as everyone did. But I think it was an easier transformation because we were quite used to working remotely and working across the globe. And working for a global company, you're used to just holding all of those meetings online and sharing the data online, etc. I think what changed the most in that setting was how we use this opportunity. So to run COVID-19 analytics, for example, looking at population mobilities, performing some research on that topic, which also raised a lot of questions around, what are the privacy concerns that we should take into account? What is the limits of what are the limits of what is possible and what is acceptable? But then it's interesting to see, now that I've moved into construction, how it has affected this industry in quite a more significant way, I would say, in terms of forcing also a cultural change. Everyone was used to just being in the office or being on site, and information was shared on a day-to-day basis. And now this information that, sometimes it wasn't as structured, now requires a bit more of a strategy. And so there had to be quite a shift in the focus and a shift in the culture to allow for this data strategy and this transformation to happen very fast, to allow us to keep working. And I think that has been, obviously it was forced, but it was a very good push forward. I think we advanced the way we look at our data and our data strategy by a good 10 years in the space of a couple of months.
I think it's interesting that both Pedro and Charles, you've both drawn on the remote working and how that has changed things. One of the big pieces of information that came out of our digital trends report this last year was the fact that lack of timely access to data was one of the biggest challenges with remote working. So Rob, have you seen, I guess, what's your experience been in that space? What are the key lessons that 2020 has taught us with that in mind?
Sure. It's a great question. There's many different ways to answer it. I suppose the tack I'd take first of all is, what have I seen? I've seen the fact that the digital data strategy is no longer seen as a standalone or adjunct to wider business strategy. What you've seen is a coming together of that thing that was kind of niche, kind of done by technical people. That is now core business strategy. Digital data is an enabler for delivering your standard outputs for the business. And we've had some great examples there of home working, remote access to data. That is not a niche concern that's handed over to the technical representatives. That is a board level consideration. So I suppose, what have I seen in 2020? I've seen credibility brought to this space. We could talk for a long time about the sort of psychological impact of COVID, the COVID pandemic, and essentially what was something that was speculative science fiction becoming the lived reality of people day to day. Well, in many ways, without pushing the metaphor too much, we've seen that in the digital space. This is something that people in our community have been talking about for a long time. We need to really get behind this. And we've seen now we are front and center. We're part of core business planning and sustainability. So what have I seen? I think at a sort of macro level, it's really been that realization that, this isn't a bet. This is actually a strategic goal of our organizations to get behind it. The free flow of information, insight, and the ability to connect virtually, absolutely critical to our future endeavors.
Thank you, Rob. And Rupesh, I'd like to come to you next to build on what Rob's saying there. Have you seen other lessons that kind of data leaders need to be taking into 2021?
Yes, obviously. So as Rob quoted quite well, it's not just about any more data strategies as a standalone thing. It's become a kind of business imperative and business strategy. What we have seen actually kind of coming from the manufacturing industry and also kind of the other connected our supplier base and the whole ecosystem is that the pandemic is not just require us to sort of accelerate the digitalization. The companies which were in the digitalization, building up digitalization capabilities. We have been required to sort of stay more connected with our customers, even though we work. I mean, it's 2020, right? It was most of the businesses are connected with their customers, but we have been even kind of forced or required to be more connected with the customers, be more omnipresent, be more ubiquitous in terms of our service offerings and location agnostic. So in a way, this all turns into how can we not only get fastest access to data, but as well kind of how also enable really fast innovation with the data to be able to not only sustain and retain our kind of current businesses, but also kind of tap into new opportunities on how to really not only serve the customers which are in different phases and unimpacted by pandemic, but also see new opportunities coming out of how to create new business models for the customers to match their conditions and match their business models and so on. So in a way, it has required the businesses to reinvent themselves in a way to, in some cases, sustain their current businesses and also find new opportunities and be even more connected with the customers and the overall ecosystem. So that is really the kind of requirements for even the data strategy, that how can we find whenever it's about finding new opportunities or finding new capabilities, it's all about data and getting the data to innovate, getting the data to really connecting the data across ecosystem and so on. So the data strategy has become a sort of a very, very crucial and a very core part of the business strategy even. So similar experience on our side as well.
Thank you. And I think that you've kind of all answered my next question, which was going to be how can business leaders and data leaders work together to support key business outcomes? I think there's a clear consensus that data strategy is becoming even more core than it was in the past. But Pedro, if I could come to you for that, how can business and data leaders work together?
So it's a very broad question, isn't it? I think what we've been saying here, and Rob pointed it out very clearly, is that data strategies need to not be sort of like its own vertical, and they need to go across the business. It's important to bring everyone together and sort of find, not look at data as a standalone function, but as something that will enable the whole organization. And this comes from a technical perspective, obviously, which is where it has been sitting in some ways for a long time, but also from a commercial perspective, from a strategic direction perspective, from a security, from a branding, marketing, the way we reach out to our consumers. It's an all-encompassing thing, and I think that has become perfectly clear over the last year that it needs to be that way, because without the data and the information, we won't be able to function. And it also opens all of these opportunities. So when we bring people together, and that's something that's part of the work that we have been doing here at Laing, is bringing everyone together in the same room and trying to define the priorities for the business and look at them from a data perspective and see, okay, what can we do to reach our goals, our strategic goals, and support that with the use of our data. And obviously at Laing we're doing quite a large transformation, and that's a very exciting space to be in. But even in industries where this transformation is a bit lower, I think in some cases it has been lacking this cross-functional talk. And it's important to see it not just from the company's perspective, but also from social perspective and society's perspective. And I think that's another point, and just going back into what has changed. And I'm sorry for going back on the topics here, but I think it's a very important point on what has changed in terms of how society views the use of data, because with this pandemic, we've all been looking at solutions and looking at how governments are tracking the pandemic, how our information is being shared. And that has raised quite a lot of privacy questions and ethics questions that are very valid and that should be addressed. And we should find a way to do things right and make sure that we're all comfortable with the way things are done. And I think that's a very, very important change, I think, in the mindset.
A big challenge for data leaders as well, isn't it, in the kind of upcoming years. I'd like to just go to a couple of questions that have come through the chat. We've had one coming from Steve Wright, which I think is kind of linking back to stuff that Rupesh was sharing earlier. He's asking, what help do you think small and medium-sized companies, perhaps ones without a CIO, need to further digitalize? Charles, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think irrespective of the organization's size, our experience, as we end up talking to, have the benefit, if you like, of talking to lots of different organizations, is that the changes that are going on in the world of IT to make you more competitive are driving innovations like the moves to the cloud, AI, digitization of omni-channel services and so on. And I think whether you're a small company or a large, you still face the same competitive challenges. So I think the importance is understanding how the technology can help enable you, not by a means to itself, but as a facilitation to the business strategy. And I think Rob put this very well, where he was explaining that the data strategy needs to fit in to the wider business strategy and how that maps on. One of the challenges we see is that you end up with it either a situation where you can maybe have a bottleneck in IT and the business can't get it, or you open things up a little bit too much, you empower the users, and now you have the Wild West with shadow IT taking place, people wrapping their arms around data sets that they keep locally, and you get different views of the truth and challenges with security and governance and so on. We find ourselves a lot of times using data virtualization to address those kind of issues. But I think whether you're a small or a large organization, those are always going to be the issues. The scale of them might change, but the issues remain the same.
So I think you've mapped out there, Charles, a bit of two ends of the spectrum, where you've got the IT bottleneck, and then on the other side you've got users that are almost too empowered. Where's the happy medium? What do you think is that perfect balance?
Well, yeah, that is a good question. And using data virtualization, we find ourselves giving an organization the ability to create their data models in a centralized virtual environment. Because if you give it to the users, they'll write it in their end user tools, whether that be Power BI or Tableau or Click or whatever. But of course, then someone else comes along with a different tool and you can't share those data models. So putting everything in the virtual environment gives you the benefit that IT still has the security and the control, the centralized audit, the management and so on, but you've empowered the users to get what they want. And it's that balance. It's always a compromise. There's no silver bullet to any of these things, but it's the compromise that means that IT don't become a bottleneck for the business, and the business get their agile BI and self-service, and other consumers as well. It may be applications rather than people who are consuming the data, that they can be facilitated so that they get what they want quickly into the applications, and the users of those applications then can get what they need without this need for this friction between the bottleneck and the Wild West, as it were.
It's a good phrase, the Wild West. Rupesh, I wonder if I could come to you next, just in terms of, I guess, your experience in your organization of that kind of using that centralized tool, and how that's panned out for you.
Yeah, I think there are two questions on the chat, and I see a common perspective on both the questions. So in a way, as we are now into this pandemic, and all different kinds of businesses, whether big ones or small ones, and they are required to find trade-offs between really kind of making new investments and really kind of still bringing that innovation faster and still bringing those kind of new capabilities faster to the market. So the key there is that I think the business leaders and IT leaders need to work really together to really first of all understand what are those essential capabilities, what are those essential use cases that would really serve the needs, whether to keep the existing business in the sustain mode or to really tap into those key opportunities. And then really find even agile ways to quickly innovate and test those opportunities, and converts into how fast you can get access to your data, how fast you can make it available to the people who are building the digital capabilities or innovating with those. So in a way, it's a balance between really prioritizing the kind of turnkey projects and then finding really agile ways to get the data and also use the tools which wouldn't require necessarily heavy investment in the beginning, but definitely once you have found those kind of really turnkey projects which would then really serve the purpose and show sort of a business outcomes, you could kind of take the investment decisions and so on. So it's really not anymore a handover situation wherein business gives requirements, IT finds the solutions, and then it's we have seen in last 1 year that the those kinds of traditional processes didn't actually sort of hold true, and a more agile, a more sort of co-innovation and cooperation is needed, and then that's the key to kind of stay sort of still within the pandemic, kind of more relevant and more kind of realistic to today's situation. So that would be my kind of a perspective from what we have seen in last 1 year.
Thank you, Rupesh. Rob, you look like you're about to say something.
I always look like I'm about to say something. The trick is stopping me saying something, Shamma, as you know very well. I was going to say, I really like those questions. I'm having a good read of them. And I was trying to think of a sort of a neat way to describe my views on it. I suppose they remind me of two sort of common things I've been asked and I've seen peers asked is, number one, we are, starting out on our digital transformation journey. This is really hard. Where on earth do we start with this? The second one being, we've got so much going on. What do we do next? And I think there's the logic for both of those scenarios, a straw man for me, is really it comes down to sequencing your activity. So for the company or organization starting up, perhaps you don't have a CIO, perhaps your community isn't that well connected. Well, what you need to be looking at there is the real fundamentals. And I think I share some of the common response with Rupesh here, that it is never a bad thing to get your organizational hygiene around your data right, to understand where your data inputs are, where your outputs are, and make sure that you can turn the handle on improving that process iteratively. So data quality, are you collecting the right data? Are you using the right data? Do you have any feedback loops to understand your user iteration of your products? Is your DevSecOps approach being taken properly forward? But the general logic there being to understand that flow through of the data, look at the insight, and then try and iteratively improve. That is never a bad thing, whether you're, a two-man and a dog company or employing 20, 30, 40,000 people. That is a fundamental practice. And I have yet to see anyone who's absolutely cracked that and doesn't have to worry about it anymore. So that would be my advice to the SME. You don't need a CIO to be able to tell you to get on top of that. And that's something which the CIO won't be doing. It will be the people actually in the IT or workforce departments that are doing it. The other scenario, briefly, a company that's got loads going on, what do you do next? Well, it's about that sequencing. Look at your spread of investments, the things you're spending money on in the future, and try to work out in which order they go. In my experience, when there's a lot of activity going on, we tend to lose that sense of what's really important. And I've had the enjoyable experience of being told, I see all this activity going on, all this money being spent, but what are we actually getting from it? And I think there you need to take a balance between protecting those long-term, quite potentially dull strategic things you need to do about improving your platforms, your infrastructure, but sprinkle in these things that deliver practical benefit as you go along. You want to be polishing up elements of this process, making sure that you deliver high quality products all the time whilst doing the plumbing at an enduring basis underneath. So giving you there's no list, I think, of priorities. Well, there'd be a very long list, but my answer would be always look at your data process, look at the flow, the feedback, and the use of that, and constantly improve it. But also, if you've got a lot going on, try and sequence your activities so you can constantly get buy-in from seniors and stakeholders, because you're showing the value of the outputs whilst quietly and proficiently getting on with making sure you have an enduring fundamental infrastructure that will sustain you into the future. So I've kind of said everything there, Shama, which is pretty much in character for me. Over.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. And Pedro, I think you just looked like you were going to unmute and say agree or disagree with Rob.
I was just going to completely agree with Rob. I think this this approach of having an almost double-geared data strategy, where you look at things in the long run, but then try to find your efficiencies in the short run that will support those long-run strategies as well, is the key. And that's the hardest part, isn't it? It's gathering all of these and going back to how we have business leaders working with the data leaders. It's all one leadership team, or that's the way it should be, in order to support this, because the long-term strategic goals are usually harder to materialize or to take concrete action on and see return on that action. But as you're doing a transformation, or you're trying to transform, even if it is a small part of your business, then it's important to keep those strategic goals in mind, but make sure that you have returns on the investments that you're making, and you're taking small steps in the right direction. And just one point that I just wanted to raise here, I think I don't think there is necessarily a shortage of skills. In some areas there is, but there is a need to upskill in what are the possibilities, what can we do with data, and that's part of the journey that we're doing at Laing O'Rourke, is showing to the wider business and opening apprenticeships and having all of these learning and development schemes where people can learn how to handle data and get some basic skills. But those basic skills enable so much more, because even if people don't know how to do more advanced things, applying artificial intelligence, whatever it may be, it opens up the doors to that, and it opens up the ideas. And I think that spread of skills and that breadth of skills across the different functions in a business, no matter the size, is very important.
Definitely. And I think that leads me on to the next question, which is how to modernize data strategy. So Pedro, you've kind of been alluding to getting ready to take on those new possibilities in your data strategy, but what does it actually mean to modernize data strategy in terms of disruptive technologies and generating more insights? So Rupesh, if I could come to you for that one.
Sure. So basically, I would simply call it that the modernization, looking at the pandemic, that it really needs to be self-disruptive in a way that all the people who have seen Lord of the Rings, there was a saying that one ring to rule them all. But in the data world, it's the data strategy world or data architecture world, it's other way around. Like there is no one solution that fits all the possible use cases that you have today, and the use cases that you can anticipate in the coming future. That's what the pandemic has taught us. So self-disruptive in a way that you really need to understand different kinds of needs coming for different kinds of speed, the data being requested at different kinds of speeds and different kinds of purposes. It could be for enabling your traditional business intelligence. It could be for really exploring 10 projects at the same time with the machine learning and productizing one of them. It could be for some real-time sales, or it could be for very advanced capability as digital twin, starting with a very early implementation, which would be just rolling out to key customers. So these needs in the perspective require different speeds of data, different kinds of tools to work with the data. But at the same time, you may need to make sure the certain fundamentals, as the security, as the data quality, as Rob mentioned, these are still intact at different levels, at different flavors. You need not over-engineer them, or neither you should leave things open and so on. So the modernization should actually take into consideration all the aspects. And here I do not only mean technology, but three aspects I describe as people, process, and tools. So that, as Pedro mentioned, that you need to account for really building the competencies to be able to work with the data, to be able to build quick pipelines. You need to have processes at the same time, so that things like data as a service, in which if certain key projects which really want to find turnkey solution for in the next quarter in retail and other customer facing businesses, we have seen that companies have built overnight portals and things like that to get the more visibility and so on. So you never know when the request for data come. So you should have a team who would be able to build the data and use just minimal tools to get started with it, and still have the kind of a mindset to harden it, productize it when it's required to be, and so on. And all of this would require also a kind of a culture to allow innovation, to allow quick decision making, at the same time also keep that bare minimum kind of a security and other non-functional aspects of the thing. So your data strategy should be accounting for all of this, and that's how I see. So it's more like an evolving thing. It's more like a direction towards you don't necessarily have a fixed architecture. You have different iterations of it. So depending upon the current landscape of your use cases and so on. So it's more like kind of having these different kinds of loosely coupled building blocks for accessing the data, for processing the data, and for delivering the data, and related skill sets and related processes. So that's how I see the data strategy should be.
I think that there's a question that's come through the chat, which I think is digging in more to what you've been saying there, Rupesh. But this is a question from Alistair, so thank you for sending that in. He's saying data needs to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable in order to get the most out of it. How are you using new technologies to handle the ever increasing amounts of data and ensure that it is fair in capitals? That's really clearly important. Rob, I wonder if you've got thoughts on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. As some of you may know, I've got a long background in, I suppose, data protection, legal compliance, and that sort of thing. It's a fascinating question. So I'd throw two observations out here. Is more data always the answer here? And why do I say that? One, because I genuinely believe it's about the insight and the learning that you can drive out of data sets, and more doesn't necessarily always mean better learning from that. And the other side to that, I suppose, is the sustainability conversation. We can already see it happening in central government, and I think it's really going to spread through the tech community. What are we doing to make sure that our mission to gather ever more data, to deliver ever greater nuance to our insights, is actually being balanced in terms of our CO2 outputs? And that's not me trying to dodge the question. I suppose it's just framing the response that we absolutely need to have some compelling logic behind the data that we are drawing into our organization and generating, and the outcomes we are trying to affect. At some point, I think there will be a line in the sand that it can't always be a free-for-all. There has to be some stuff which you absolutely see as necessary to delivering that output, and others which are nice to have. I think that question around fairness, presumably we're talking about fair in terms of not just ethics, but the sort of legal frameworks here, on which point I would say anyone who's done, data mapping of their processes for GDPR compliance will know that you need to have some logic that says, we are using this data for this reason to deliver that outcome, and this is why we see that as proportionate, necessary, and fair. There's lots of quite exciting tooling out there now, from data catalogs to data catalog tooling. And there's many vendors there, I'm not going to name a particular vendor, that can actually provide that top-down view of your data estate and allow you to make those informed decisions. So in terms of business strategy, data strategy, I suppose my answer would be, and it talks a bit to the next question as well, if you can indulge me for a second. When writing a data strategy, and I've written a few of them, for me, they start and end in a very systemic way with, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What are our objectives here? And that could be both digital and business. And then at the end of that bookend is, what is our assurance to make sure we're delivering those outcomes? And that applies to the data piece as well. So for most businesses, I would say their objectives are to deliver their business objectives. And that includes growth, sustainability, delivering better quality products to the customer. How do you assure that? Well, you try to do it by the most efficient fair means possible, and data is part of that conversation. We want to make sure we're incredibly lean when we use data. And over time, I think, as we develop our insight, and whether it be analytical models or just corporate memory, we can maybe dial down the volume of data we need to collect, because we already have a very good grounding in what the answer should look like. And really what we're just doing is updating that delta of fresh information to make sure we remain current. So I'm speaking in very general terms there, and hopefully maybe if I hand over to colleagues, we can dive into that a little bit more.
Definitely, Pedro, go for it.
Could I just challenge here, and this coming from a data scientist perspective, where we tend to think that more data is always better, and just to challenge that a little bit. I do understand completely what you're saying, Rob, and I agree that sometimes it's not the quantity that matters if you don't have any quality. So I fully agree with that. I just think that there is a need to have the right skills and the right people in the room to make these decisions, because it is very, particularly in situations like if we're talking about an e-commerce business and a large corporation, or a company that has millions of customers and so has quite a lot of data points, then not capturing the right data from the start is more forgivable, because in the future, if you want to start capturing it, you wait 6 months and you get quite a large data set and you can start working on it. If we're talking about things like construction, where a single project can last a bunch of years, then it's important to have the right information at each point in time, because in order to build models and to derive insight and find the right correlations and the right insight from the pool of experience of the company, then you need to be capturing as much information as you can. And sometimes you don't know how it's going to be used or how it will be needed. But I do think that there is a level of unknown that needs to be allowed in that data capture. And just around the more specific question here of balancing, fixing foundational tools versus delivering the benefits, I think there is, for the good and the bad, there's an outstanding amount of tools nowadays out in the market. And I think, and going back to Rob's point, I think the question begins and ends with what is it that we need? What does our business need? And how are we going to fix that? And sometimes there is a need to fix foundational tools for long-term gain, but it's also really important, and this, again, from banging my own drum here with data science, but there's a need to make sure that what we're doing for the future is actually not disrupting the information that we have from the past, because otherwise it will be unusable. And if we're doing that transformation, then we need to keep that in mind and balance the two things. What are the gains that we're going to get by changing the way we report on something, and how can we build bridges between the way we were doing things back 2 years ago or right now, so that we can use all of this experience and not lose the access to all of this data.
Well, I think we've covered a lot there, and sadly I'm going to have to close the session there. And Pedro and Rob, Charles and Rupesh, thank you all for your insights.